Ah yes, the mighty Don River. This expansive waterway divides the city east to west and for centuries was uncrossable. However, could you get across? Charter a ship perhaps? Build a channel that bores miles underneath it? Perhaps build the largest steel viaduct in the world. They actually did one of those.
It's a nifty building.
Okay, today's nifty structure is the Prince Edward Viaduct. It's called Prince Edward not because it's on Prince Edward Street and connects Bloor with the Danforth, and not because Prince Edward ever actually rode across it or anything. He just thought that it was nifty, and a lot of the stodgy British Rosedale residents at one end of it, I think, really were big fans of the royalty. So during his 1919 trip across Canada, he decided to put his name on this structure, even though the structure that he opened is the Quebec Bridge. This structure is actually only 4 meters shorter than the bridge in Quebec, which would make it among the longest bridges in the world at the time. It is a viaduct, so that is kind of cheating. But for some context, Toronto is actually just a giant swamp. The ground can't actually support a megastructure like this. Even the CN Tower today is actually held to the ground with a bunch of cables that you can't see. Most of the city remains flat enough to build something on because of an intricate series of underground tunnels that keep the whole city drained. But here in the actual Don Valley, that isn't possible because the Don River flows right through here, and this place still remains fairly squashy even to today. That means that a giant stone or brick or solid concrete viaduct couldn't be constructed to bridge the valley. Lucky for the engineers at the time, though, a bunch of hip new building techniques and materials had been invented, and this sort of concrete pier structure with iron things bridging it really unlocked a lot of potential to build huge bridges, and the biggest bridges in the world were being built in Canada. The Quebec Bridge that I mentioned earlier is actually the longest bridge in the world when it was built. The video of the king, or the future king, opening the bridge calls it the longest suspension bridge in the world, and there are a lot of references to it being a suspension bridge. I find this bizarre because it's a textbook example of a cantilever bridge. The Bloor Street Viaduct is actually built sort of transverse what you're expecting. The main supports actually go perpendicular to the road structure. In this picture of them constructing it, you can see what I'm talking about. And then those sit on columns, which are then supported by those arches. And those arches are attached to these giant concrete piers by hinges. And this allows for the bridge, which is kind of sitting on some pretty marshy land, to flex and expand with temperatures and different loads. It's actually a double-decker structure. There are 4 lanes of Toronto gauge rail and 5 lanes of traffic and 2 bike lanes. This whole thing can be fully loaded with bumper-to-bumper traffic in the middle of a hot summer day and stay upright, and even on a cold winter night with no loading at all manages to stay together because of this hinge design. This bridges on a series of bridges structure is huge and allows for that double-decker structure to transport a massive amount of traffic, even by today's standards. But in 1918, the entire east side of the city was just farms. In fact, the entire city only had a population of about 250,000 people, about 210,000 of which lived in this side of the city. So this was criticized as a bridge to nowhere and a ridiculous waste of overbuilding, but pretty shortly after was praised for its foresight. In particular, the lower deck of rails, which was built almost 50 years before the rest of the east-west subway in Toronto, made it so that it was substantially cheaper to build that subway when they did. The savings on just that alone is more than the entire cost of this project, actually. It was opened in late October of 1918. But it wasn't actually a very big event when it did open. World War I was wrapping up. Italy had surrendered earlier that morning, and the British had just entered talks with the Ottomans. And the pandemic of 1918 was going on. So it was actually open with just the mayor and a few foremen from the site, and the mayor's entire speech was just saying, we will not be having any more speakers, for if we keep you any longer, we will be violating the medical officer's regulations as to gatherings of people. A quote that I think you could hear today just as well 100 years ago. The first car drove across the bridge on December 14th, 1918, and at December 14th, 1918, it looked like this, and legend has it has been gridlock ever since. The slightly longer Quebec Bridge is famous in Canadian engineering circles because of the two large workplace disasters that happened there. There's even a legend that these rings are made out of that bridge. And the king didn't want his name on the structure that caused so many deaths and was so prone to collapse. So when he saw this structure, he thought that it was an easy place for him to put his name. It does create an awkward thing, though, where as you're driving along what is clearly one street, it goes from Bloor Street to the Prince Edward Viaduct to Danforth Ave without actually really changing. Now, you can't spend much time Googling about this structure without learning that other than the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, no other structure has had more suicides take place off of it. And in 2003, after many years of lobbying, the city approved $2.4 million and raised another $2.5 million to build this large structure along the sides of the bridge. It's called the Luminous Veil. It won an award for architecture in 1999, 6 years before it was built. In the news, there's pretty much only universal praise for this structure. There's even this big party when they finally lit it up about 10 years after it was finished being built. The original design called for a bunch of interesting spotlights that I guess probably looked pretty cool on a render, but those were never added because they were too expensive. So in 2015, these LEDs were bolted on. A big trend about almost all of the buildings I've been looking at lately has been that pretty recently, like in the last 10 years or so, they've just bolted some LEDs on pretty garishly and just fire them up all night. It's a trend I'm looking forward to dying. I was trying to think of a good analogy, you know, like maybe vinyl over a hardwood floor or like a floating ceiling inside a cathedral or something, but I'm not sure those are really apt because a lot of the times those are like a weird budgetary constraint. This is something that's purely decorative and I think intended as an improvement that I really strongly feel actually detracts from the structure. The reason I think this case is so egregious is this is a giant marvel of Edwardian engineering. When the future king of Canada saw this, he said, wow, this is a structure that should bear my name. It's an absolutely beautiful structure. It's got those big concrete pillars and the wrought iron arches in between with all of their supports, and even by today's standards it looks modern. So you can imagine 100 years ago what this really must have looked like. It was 50 years ahead of its time when they built it. And yeah, then in 2015 somebody said, you know what really would make that pop? Just a big rectangular slab of LEDs across the top, and they put them on, and I don't know. The only analogy I can think of is it's like putting an auto-generated beat on top of a Mozart. So enjoy that. Without any context, the structure does just look like a suicide net. It clearly doesn't serve any structural or decorative purpose on first glance. It just looks like a bunch of metal cobwebs that are definitely not just intended for accidental falls. But after learning about all of the architecture that went into it and the interesting design around the lighting and the story of how it got built, I frankly still don't see it. It really just looks like a suicide net to me. I think the biggest piece of praise I can give it is better than a chain link fence, and I struggle to do even that with conviction. A lot of the news articles claim that it's 100% effective, but journals done at the time, which looked at the over 15,000 suicides that happened in Toronto in the 9 years leading up and 4 years after the construction of this structure, shows that it did absolutely nothing to reduce the number of suicides that happened in the city. Even specific things like suicides by jumping from tall structures. This really just kicks the problem down the road. Actually, I'm going to go a step further and straight up insult this thing. I think that the name Luminous Veil, instead of just calling it a suicide net, is because of the big stigma around suicide, and I think that that stigma is what keeps it out of the news and keeps us from talking about it. It is the second deadliest things for people in my demographic, 15 to 44-year-old Canadian males. The only thing deadlier are the cars. And to me, the name Luminous Veil really sounds like it's just a cute fairy tale name trying to, cover up the actual purpose of this structure, lest it make anybody uncomfortable. I'm not sure that that actually helps secure funding to treat it like the preventable public health crisis that it is. Anyway, now you know all about the engineering and architectural masterpiece that is the Bloor Street Viaduct. Next time you're stuck in traffic under it, do take time to check out all of the interesting ways that all of the different beams all lean on each other and on the piers, and just try to imagine how those forces creep around. It's actually quite interesting. It's even more amazing to think about the fact that the entire thing is built on top of mud and was built during a war and during a pandemic in a city where there was only a few thousand people living on the east side. And the amount of foresight that went into this giant project like this. I sometimes wish that we would abandon our immediate utilitarian thing and build some sort of 21st century bridge to nowhere. I think that the city long term would benefit from things like that. Anyway, have a beautiful day. Perfect. Okie dokie. Ha! That is slippery. Okay, we're moving that.